publicly traded American companies in the 2000s. They'd make money, infect the soul of man with greed, and this one did a lot of fraud. These companies also often created two types of annual reports on the financial state of the company. The 10K, which was filed with the Security and Exchange Commission, was a legal document. It's wordy, legal diarrhea, and boring in the way that these documents are and should be. The other is a glossy annual report. This one is from today's protagonist, EA, from the year 2000. It's legally binding enough that you can't straight up lie about your profits, but if you wanted to say something like, the next generation of games created by EA will be so realistic that, at a glance, they could be mistaken for a telecast of the events they represent.
Been playing for Manchester United recently, Nicky.
Go ahead. The glossy annual report wasn't filed with the SEC, it was pumped out to shareholders, dressed up like a kind of financial Nintendo Power. Advertisements on a stock for people who had already bought in, with the hopes that they'd buy a little bit more. Between paragraphs so self-congratulatory they wrote themselves into a self-suck Ouroboros, there were some actual insights into the operations. The year 2000 was about to be the next technological leap. The Dreamcast had raced to market in 1999, not noticing its imminent heart attack. Sony was set up to enter the fray with the PlayStation 2, and Nintendo and Microsoft were set up to find their way into the market by 2001. When discussing the company's strategic future, EA's report states, "Our goal is to be the market leader on the next generation of video game consoles." One of the ways they would do that would be with
EA Sports. Big.
The idea was simple. EA at the turn of the millennium was well diversified as a publisher. System Shock 2 and Shaq Fu might have been developed by Delphine Software and Looking Glass and Irrational Games respectively, but the cash behind the projects was EA. As a developer though, they had a core. If it's not real life sports, real life cars, there wasn't a real life in them touching it. They weren't developing the most sophisticated simulators of the time, but that's what they wanted you to think. That somehow StarCraft for the English was one-to-one with professional football. An identity isn't a problem, it was in fact working pretty well for EA, as year on year they'd boast multiple millions in profit. But if they wanted to meet their proposed goal, it was important for them to dig into the weeds and get their hands dirty. They'd acquire teams like DreamWorks Interactive and rebrand them into EA Los Angeles to develop Medal of Honor under EA Games. Their usual titles would be developed under EA Sports, and finally, you had EA Sports Big. It was set up with two halves. The first would eventually capture the new market of the same sports they were already profiting from. Games like NBA Street, NFL Street, FIFA Street, Shocks. Remember Shocks? These games, and the incentive behind their development, make a lot of sense. They're more approachable, condensed versions of the sports that already exist. They're fantasized with additional elements or ignoring the rules of professional play to make for something familiar, while also not being so strict to the stuff as to turn people away who are looking for something more gamey. By releasing under the Big branding, it allowed EA to capitalize on the overflowing demand for football without potentially damaging the existing EA Sports brand by drawing away from that simulator idea. The other half would get to work setting up something that was a little more off the wall. It was still a calculated move from the company, but for many would become a quintessential embodiment of the 2000s. SSX was far from an original concept. It followed in the lines of games like 1080, Snowboard Kids, Cool Boarders, you get it, it's snowboarding. Sparse competitors in tow, it wasn't breaking new ground, and it also wasn't trying to rush to the bottom of the financial mountain before the snow melted. What it did do, however, was develop a financial testbed for EA. As stated in EA's 2006 report, Big was supposed to support the push for alternative sports games, that's FIFA Street and the like, and extreme sports. On the one hand, SSX was a labor of love. Steve Reckschaffner had worked at EA for a while. He'd worked on FIFA 94, then again with Triple Play Baseball, and as financial successes, that gave him the freedom to work on a title of his own. He had a history with winter sports and wanted to make a racing game specifically off of the back of Bordercross, a game birthed from his interests rather than a mind map prompted, profit-driven endeavor. This was a game that he'd sat on for so many years it was originally conceptualized for the Sega Saturn. When the PS2 rolled around and tech finally picked up, along with Sony needing a fresh new firework to push the system, Steve and a small team headed to Tokyo to cook up SSX. EA as a company might have just loved Steve's passion and drove an entire division to be made just for them, or maybe it was the cash that gluttonous hog Tony Hawk's Pro Skate was gorging itself on. Conveniently timing itself around 1999, Activision had stumbled into a breadwinner. Before milking the udder of modern military shooters, Activision's champion cattle battle was Pro Skater, and the poor bull had the milking machine set to Rapid. Whether by circumstance or calculation, extreme sports was EA's next area of interest, and it makes sense. Commercial interest in extreme sports had picked up generally, in large part thanks to the success of the X Games and Winter X Games. Like any good glory hunter, it was so popular, EA had already tried to cash in before Tony Hawk had showed up. They'd published X Games Pro Border on the PlayStation 1, however they were only the publisher, with Radical Entertainment developing, and Steve Rechtschaffner wasn't involved. Remind yourself we're only one step away from the timeline split from EA being the owners of the Tony Hawk franchise. And right before you think thank God, remind yourself Activision owns it, making that timeline indistinguishable from our own. When Activision noticed this a little bit earlier with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, they were rewarded heavily. It was so successful that, on its own, Tony Hawk as a collective franchise accounted for 25% of the company's revenue for the year 2001, with 2 games out. That game's success was a mix of first mover's advantage and incredibly, inexplicably lucky timing. Most people hadn't played the slim pickings of skateboarding games already out there, and Tony Hawk was upping his brand the way that a TikTok finance grifter could only dream of. There's a strong chance that EA saw this success as a threat, and they'd be right. Activision had a similar business model at the time, just with a greater focus on licensed games. They were a THQ, a name you saw on almost every box in the bargain bin, who would occasionally back a hit but had a portfolio dominated by Shark Tale, Shrek 2, Shrek 3, Shrek Super Slam, and Call of Duty. If extreme sports ended up being the next large market, not only would Activision benefit greatly from their already established position, they'd also potentially take away from the growth of EA if interest in traditional sports waned as a result of cultural shifts. If Activision attempted to grow in the extreme sports department beyond Tony Hawk, they'd have dominance over the market, shutting out other competitors, something EA knew exceedingly well because this was the exact position they were in with traditional sports games. In America, they dominated markets to the point that nobody else could compete, with their only real competition being in the world game, Wii. There they had to compete with Konami's PES, which at the time boasted substantially better gameplay. FIFA wanted to be considered a simulator, but it was slop for the trough. A trough with all the right branding, giving it an air of legitimacy to those not in the weeds of the game. PES offered what was considered the premium experience, with slightly tastier slop in a slightly shinier trough. The direct competition was a headache. EA couldn't make a dent in Asian markets with Konami's hometown following, and instead had to compete in Europe. And thanks to the world of global finance, a sale in Europe was worth a lot more than a sale at home. Attempting to directly compete with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater would be repeating competition. They might win big with an unlikely second mover's advantage of building on top of another company's success, but they'd just as likely make research and development a bonfire fueled exclusively by cash. EA's similarly established market position, an emerging market, and already existing competition, put a game about snowboarding in a prime position, just different enough to not directly compete, but similar enough to get a foothold in the space. It was a reliable foundation of interest that SSX could build modest sales on top of. At the time, SSX reviewed pretty well. Without a doubt, SSX is the best snowboarding game, and as a launch title in North America, set itself up well to impress, particularly in the graphical jump, even if the game itself is a little dry. Racing down its handful of courses to beat your opponents and doing tricks to gain boost is conceptually sparse, but a flashy chunk of entertainment. There's a nice rhythm to the tracks. It never feels like you're repeating the same ideas through each level, even if they're limited to big air, big speed, big rail. Presentation was set up as extreme sports, but functionally, racing was key here. A lackluster trick system that has moves visually distinct from one another while being functionally identical needed something extra to bolster the system. The game put some emphasis on tricking with the show-off mode, where hitting certain targets during a trick would give a multiplier, but tricks seemed more secondary to finding shortcuts and new ways around the level. This is even reflected in the trick dedicated mode by putting most of the multipliers inside of shortcuts, rewarding exploration above all other elements of play. Today I'd say that the original SSX is unfocused. It's a racing game, but none of the AI seems to keep up. It's an extreme sports score builder, but the trick system is so simple that it becomes a glorified platformer. It splits the attention between two styles of play and doesn't really succeed to any great degree at either. As a showcase though, a new game for your new console for your new potential profit piggies, the feeling was one of huge scope and possibility. This one felt a little bit too hard. Don't say that. Now, however, there's a sense that something's missing, that this is more than a glorified tech demo of most launch titles, while also a game that's blocked out without being smoothed out. Your character controls stiff at points, and you'll interact with the world in ways that feel unintended. Just give him a moment. Just give him a... Okay, is this all a part of Steve's vision? Something that's easy to overlook when you're enamored with your new toy, and enamored many people were. While specific sales figures have never been released, if you look at EA's 2002 annual report, there's a graphic that states games that sold in millions by year of release, of which SSX was one of them. This might not be entirely representative of how many people at one point had purchased it, however. Secondhand games markets was still a significant market factor at this point. SSX came off of the back of a whole new generation, making the total amount of secondhand sales lower than, say, 3 to 4 years into the console life cycle. But a secondhand market inherently dilutes the amount of sales that are generated from the more casual observers that make up the majority of the sales deeper into a product's life cycle. Any numbers that EA could release would only ever represent the sales that they saw, not necessarily the amount of willing pay pigs. Now, considering nobody really remembers SSX 2000 specifically, chances are this was on the lower side, and while $1 million might have been a success, its largest achievement was a strong showing for a brand new IP. It should be noted that while this is a good showing for a new IP, it had the bias of being a launch title for a system that gave it a benefit of minuscule competition. This can inflate the potential interest in an IP beyond what might actually be there several years into a console's life cycle. Remember Red Steel for the Wii? Being a launch title, you probably do. Did you know they made a second one? The reason I bring this up is to point out that SSX, on its own, likely would not have had that much of an impact, and while it's a very important game, what had a larger impact is what comes next. Despite that, financial year 2001 was a year of losses for EA, but it wasn't all too surprising. It was a new console cycle, applying pressure at both ends. For EA, this meant new hardware requiring a whole new suite of tools, driving up the cost of research and development. To jump forward in the timeline a bit, in their 2005 financial report, they boasted an impressive $504 million in profit. In the 2006 financial report, when new tech would be developed for the Xbox 360, they'd lose roughly $26 million in profit compared to 2005. Roughly a 50% drop, even if it wasn't running at a loss. And in 2007, as the PS3 revealed itself to be a developer's first layer of hell, that drop was even further. Alright, back to financial year 2001. For the consumer, this meant having to buy new hardware, ultimately leading to the consumer having less money to spend on your software. Success in the future would almost always be larger year on year as the consumer base grew. Big, like other arms of EA, would attempt to run on a yearly release cycle. SSX was this year, and following its success was going to attempt a repeat while other games were in development. So come the year 2001, which was financial year 2002, they were ready to take another ride. This time with... what is it called? It's like... It's tricky. This is where SSX really takes off. Run DMC rocking a rhyme out of your speakers was a common theme in the early 2000s. Sales data for these games in specific has never been released, but anecdotally, ask anyone who remembers SSX, chances are they'll remember the one that's tricky. What's funny is that while calling SSX Tricky a whole new game, while literally correct, almost feels spiritually wrong. The 8 levels in SSX 1, they make a return in one fashion or another, remixed into better versions of themselves. The new levels? There's 2. The majority of the gameplay is determined by the levels, and they added 2. There is a timeline split where Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare expansion packs held the gravity to make Call of Duty 5 slightly moderner warfare. For all its many redundancies, Tricky is a much better game than SSX 2000's despite the similarities. From the front butthole of Larry Lapierre,
you tend to kind of design something that is way beyond the scope of what you can actually pull off in the first versions.
Now we get to take the fruits of our labor and say, okay, we got the core experience down, now let's build the worlds we really wanted to build.
This is the next SSX, but this is what SSX should have been the first time around. Those returning levels have all been expanded in some ways to offer more variation and replayability. Your character can now roll a small amount in the air, letting you clean up your landings with more consistency. They added uber tricks that have their own unique animations, but more importantly, provide more points and can't be cancelled out of. You're not exactly hunting for spots to uber trick, but you need to be conscious of what can and can't support an uber. You'll want to uber not only to keep your meter up to boost more, but because if you manage to do 6 in the course of a race, you'll get unlimited boost, a welcome buff in a race, and while it doesn't do much in the contest mode, you still want to uber to maximize your points. It creates a goal, but it also adds fundamental variation in trying to meet that goal. Some tricks are to build boost, some are to build towards the unlimited boost. Sometimes you take a shortcut that doesn't allow you to do any of that, but is fast enough to justify it, or leads to a multiplier that's more valuable in the long term. It develops an ebb and flow. The little big medium rule applied to a video game about going down a hill. Tricky isn't better because Joseph Simmons asks you to solve a Rubik's Cube before making the number go up. It's better because it creates more defined points of play to spread throughout an already defined base. But who cares, because it's tricky! Arguably more important than that is a smooth landing on an aesthetic. This sound? That's the sound right before you hit the pearly gates. You never get booted into a normal menu, everything is a vaguely sci-fi show floor, and when the announcers come through it's always with a record scratch. It's very late 90s, early 2000s, but it gives the entire experience an identity. It's not just snowboarding, it's snowboarding, but with reverb, and neon signs, and advertising. I have a second channel. Do you like slop and gruel? Maybe even sludge? Check out Not Leon Massey, where we have things like opinions, and rants, and not a lot else. My hobbies include playing video games and getting angry at the internet. There's not a lot else that goes on in my life. Why won't a woman love me? You know, instead of doing this, I could have sold you anything. And I would have made like at least $1,000. Like, could have been display or like a shit coin. My life choices aren't going so well. Tricky really brought what SSX should have been together, from a product that I think is mediocre to even bad, to rough around the edges but still enjoyable from the modern day. Retrospectively, SSX Tricky was a huge risk. Fans of sports games might happily wait at their yearly food bowl for their delightful slop, but this new audience could have rejected it as a repeated trick. You know what they say though, one man's slop is this Englishman's treasure. Tricky cemented SSX as a name within the extreme sports space, a space that was carving out extremely quickly. Activision, seeing the success of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, saw an opportunity to capitalize. Like a mother bird, it would chew up the food of formatting and vomit out whatever it could into the consumer's mouth. Yearly Tony Hawk's games came alongside Matt Hoffman's BMX, Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer, Wakeboarding Unleashed featuring who? And very importantly in 2001, Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder. None of the other games that Activision released in the barrage of profit-driven assault reviewed in stellar fashion, but also didn't get what should have been brutal critique. Retrospectively, the most valuable things these games do is reveal how unusual Pro Skater's quality is. Uniquely though, Sean Palmer couldn't escape the looming shadow of SSX. As David Smith wrote for IGN, given the presence of SSX Tricky on the racks right next to it, Sean Palmer doesn't deserve a second look or even a first. And it absolutely didn't stop there. This one doesn't have the skills to out-trick or out-race its tricky competition. Subpar entry into the genre that is already being dominated by EA Big's SSX series. If SSX wasn't around, maybe this point of comparison wouldn't bring down what is otherwise a derivative but fine twist on Pro Skater. Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer got away with modest reviews despite only having enough content to compete with the crumbs at the bottom of a crisp packet, thanks to a lack of comparison. Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, on the other hand, might not have been scrutinized particularly hard, but still occasionally snagged against comparisons against Dave Mirra's BMX, limiting its success. This was published by Acclaim, a company who wanted to purchase advertising space on Tombstones, who also set up their own extreme sports publishing label before promptly imploding. With SSX, EA had successfully positioned themselves as a roadblock to snub Activision's growth, and for it they were rewarded. In the 2002 financial report, Tricky also worms its way up to the million sales chart. It's certainly not the highlight, however. It's sitting in a comfortable position with a couple million sales without blowing EA out of the water. If it had, they would have treated it more like the latest Harry Potter outing, boasting about its 9 million sales. Compared to the previous year, EA's development costs stayed relatively consistent, while putting more money into marketing and bounced back to a profit of 101 million. It was a good year for EA, it was a good year for SSX, it was a bad year to be an employee. As the internet was taking hold proper, companies were over-investing in their online presence. There was a huge influx of users, and as a result was assumed to have a large portion of paying customers. In the age of the early internet though, very few were willing to pay for a service, and the barrier to a person or entity creating a competing service was low. The rapid growth of the internet encouraged some investment into the space, in spite of the fact that almost every online venture wasn't profitable. Rapid growth of a potentially new market spurred speculation in the stock market, resulting in grossly overestimated stock prices, with companies being valued in the billions of dollars on revenues of a couple of million, almost always with net incomes at a loss. There's a great book on this called .con by John Cassidy that goes into a lot of how this stuff impacted the stock market specifically if you're interested. The stock market would have encouraged EA to put an emphasis on an internet-focused division in an attempt to drive up the stock price, along with a fear of being left behind in the potentially emerging market in spite of no cash flow to prove it. As the bubble collapsed, there was less incentive to invest in the division, while also becoming clear that they had overhired for the area specifically, so EA would see this as a sign to lay employees off. Since EA wasn't an exclusively online company though, they still operated at a profit through their main venture, so the layoffs were less about structural danger within the company, instead about fixing overhiring. Perhaps counterintuitively, in 2002, EA would put SSX away. Not for very long, mind you. They experimented with Sledstorm, which dares to ask the question, what if you put some of SSX's DNA in an arcadey racer? And also, what if we made it a bit shit? Alongside Freakstyle, which dared to ask the question, what if we did Sledstorm, but it was okay? EA had halted Activision in its tracks, and then attempted to repeat its mistakes, taking the formula of success and remixing it with bargain bin precision. My thoughts on a blockbuster second-hand mainstay aren't important though. Reviewers at the time would have told you that they were fine, even good. Freakstyle even sold well enough to get a greatest hits version on PlayStation 2, but a lack of a sequel in the following year implies an air of failure. Even so, it was a good year for EA, tripling their profits. In 2003, the company, perhaps playing it safe, went back to a proven franchise, and so we got SSX 3. Structurally identifiable as SSX, 3 is surprisingly different from Tricky, and given just a couple of minutes of playtime, it's not hard to see where that year away went. SSX 3 envisions a huge connected mountain. Data streaming technology might have been limited at the time, but EA managed a perfect landing on a seamless sled from point to point. Nowadays, we might be able to go to the magic show of video games and recognize a long, tight, mostly vacant hallway for a loading zone. In 2003, a couple of years before Whimsy went extinct, this was a new trick to give the game a grander scope than all the previous entries, which for it I think is a bit more of a side grade than anything. The mountain is cool, but it doesn't have a defined space the way that Tricky does. The sense that every level is a handcrafted, man-made experience allows them to frame different parts of the course with unusual emphasis. A shortcut feels like you're cheating a little. Pop my Mario warp whistle so Luther can suck my digital nuts. 3 is a mountain. There's motifs within its treacherous environments, but it lacks points of exaggerated identity to maintain a sense of place. Transition from one type of space to another too fast and there'd be a sense that you'd flicked a switch. It's giving Dark Souls 2, don't you agree? On the other hand, while the lack of shortcuts that make you feel like you're skulking around the rafters of the track aren't there, you're provided a sense of immersion. An off the beaten path ice cave isn't 3 seconds removed off of my time that sits on my memory card. There's a sense it's an organic byproduct of the mountain itself, even if it's handcrafted by a level designer. The same can be said about the aesthetics. Tricky has a tone. Eddie's an incel, Simon's watched too much anime, Elise serves and throughout an ensemble of caricatures, the game is, in itself, a character. It's a kind of oddly impersonal nature of Y2K futurism, which at the time would have just been futurism, with a soundscape of samples and scratches. It's an odd contrast, and that being the backdrop for these simple but loud characters and varied environments provides a vibrant sense of charisma. 3 has its own visual identity, it's just not as bold. It's identifiably 2000s, it's just in that milder 2003 way before the angst and edge of 2005 would hit. It's smoothed out graphics with a colored drop shadow. Interesting without being as present as Tricky. With an entire mountain to make, one that doesn't have the blessing of loading screens between places, the visual identity took a hit, likely so that it didn't clash against what is otherwise just the PS2's attempt at a real place. Look at that advertisement. It doesn't feel out of place here because the environment is deliberately a place that could naturally exist. This one's upside down. For as much as visually Tricky outpaces 3, the second-to-second gameplay of 3 blows Tricky out of the water, in my opinion. Where Tricky asks you to consider where you're going to end your flips, 3 will finish things up for you so long as you just give it the wheel. In some respects, this dismantles an element of play. The big risk of Tricky is less all-encompassing, as 3 lets you have more room for error. However, 3's more dense environments asks you to more frequently consider where you're landing. There's an immediate ask for action at the end of each trick in 3, so the game puts in more work for you, letting you think more about what's coming rather than having to be pinpoint accurate with your current action. If this kind of handholding was present in Tricky, it would have hampered that variation in points of play, by making higher risk tricks not necessarily as load-bearing. In a game with more involved levels, the change wasn't just welcome, it was necessary. Now you aren't just locked into normal tricks and uber tricks, you now have to work your way towards multiple layers of uber trick that get more committal as time goes on. Planning your route around the level also involves planning how you're going to get into a spot that lets you max out your meter. The big, medium, small gameplay of Tricky is given a sense of progression through a level, making the racing portion of play more rewarding and the trick contest portion of play less repetitive. To add to that, 3 also adds board presses, manuals, and a new kind of combo system, and this is where the changes start to get a little divisive. When a trick ends, it counts into a timer, and when another trick is performed inside of that timer, it adds to a combo. Landing that combo successfully gives whatever is banked. It sounds very Tony Hawk adjacent. Whether or not this was a move from EA's higher-ups to attempt directly competing with Tony Hawk, or merely taking a page out of Activision's book, the parallel is undeniable. The part it plays here is much less focused, however. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is a game where the combo is the game. In SSX, it's merely a small segment in a larger whole, and emphasizing it doesn't inherently improve the experience. You do this like 3 more times in the game, by the way. But I mean, like, it's 2003. What, you want to rush to go and see? American Pie 4? Let's be serious now. Combos add a layer of gameplay to going down the mountain. However, keeping a combo going often requires you to actively hamper the flow of movement. Manuals reduce traction, turning becomes stiffer, and speed is gained slower. The trade-off is control for points. And while it's interesting on paper, on the more dense levels it feels clumsy. SSX as a mechanical identity before this point came from its breaking up between tricking and racing, how those two are tangentially connected, and occasionally how a rail intertwines them. Manuals and the combo counter imply that tricking should be more consuming within the experience, something closer to what Pro Skater is, despite the level design and general goal not perfectly aligning with that vision. During the early levels, many of which feel closer to the lax structure of Tricky, this feels great as it gives you a middle goal between larger tricking opportunities. On the later levels that are more hazardous, keeping a combo going is a frustrating balancing act, not between you and the character, but between you and the level, which can sometimes feel like you're being punished for not knowing which direction would have let you more comfortably keep the combo going. It creates a game that has much higher highs with slightly lower lows. I have a strong preference for 3. In my eyes, and many others, this is the peak. That's not to dismiss the people who prefer Tricky. Its more consistent experience and generally stronger aesthetic makes for a game that's maybe a little less immediately enjoyable, but still a lot of fun. The debate at launch, however, was non-existent. There is no SSX democracy, God save our gracious 3. Each game pushing 9 out of 10s isn't really an indicator of an upward trend. Remember though that as this console generation progressed, the scope and expectations for games were increasing rapidly. Maintaining your review score between 2000 and 2003 meant evolving release on release. The hardware that would be making Super Buster Move would 3 years later be pushing out Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. A 9 in 2000 was nothing compared to a 9 in 2003. It shouldn't come as much as a surprise then that, much like Tricky, SSX3 was a success. People looking for an extreme sports game that year had to choose between SSX3 and Tony Hawk's Underground, a position so filled with FOMO it could strike empathy into the heart of the most dedicated sociopath. 2003, financial year 2004, was a great year for EA. If there was any doubt that SSX was a household name before, it was wiped away by the fact that the only snowboarding competition it had was copies of itself. This position, however, seems to have contributed little to EA's astronomical 500 million in profit. When discussing the games that contributed largest, SSX isn't mentioned. In fact, SSX 3 is only ever mentioned to help describe the purpose of EA Big and a graphic indicating that our special little boy hit his goal. When describing their model of success, they bring up titles like Need for Speed and Medal of Honor as hits. These are games that impress them enough that they think the success will perpetuate itself, and for the most part, they were right. What's maybe more important is where that success was coming from. Now 3 years into a console life cycle, the profits were bound to soar. The PlayStation, Xbox, GameCube, they'd all established themselves as standard at this point. The cash that was reserved for hardware in the previous years was now moving into the games themselves. 2003 would have also been a sweet spot for timing. The second-hand market would have been present, but the frequency in which good games hit blockbuster shelves meant that few new games would have to compete at the same price as two old bangers. Both casual and core gamers were split between the same choices, since the price point that split up games you'd heard of wouldn't have been that distinct from one another. A game as good as SSX 3 was hard to fumble. Its success in the year 2003, however, might not be representative of success in the future. EA also made specific note on the importance of foreign markets. The US dollar was doing particularly poorly around this time. $1 in 2000 was equivalent to roughly 73 pence. By 2003, that same dollar would only get you around 50 pence. While this wasn't bad for EA's domestic sales, it meant that anything that did well abroad would have converted into a higher value. This gave games like Need for Speed and FIFA, games with broader, more European appeal, substantially more value than games catering specifically to the American market. That's not to say that SSX's success was isolated to the US. This isn't Madden. It's just a potential challenge if the domestic interest in extreme sports was to slow down. Tracking this interest, particularly in games where only Tony Hawk and SSX had any real staying power, would be difficult, made even harder by the fact that SSX would take a year off. Hitting the peak of the series was nice, but if you're at the top, the only way is down. When On Tour hit shelves in 2005, things had changed. Perhaps least important of those changes was SSX itself. No longer an off-the-wall experiment from an employee who had proved themselves, it was a franchise that had developed its own legs enough that the man who birthed the brainchild didn't even work on it. Steve Reckshaften's last credited game would be Def Jam Fight for New York, and while it's impossible to say how much was directly crafted from his fingertips over the last 3 projects, or how heavy was EA's whip that forced SSX to be the way that they wanted it to be, the vibe here is immediately distinct from the rest of the series. As present as the cover, there's a shift in tone, opting for sketchbook visuals, a primarily rock-driven OST, less electronic, more angst. This is a kind of vibe shift that's present in more than its presentation. You still have the idea of going down one interconnected mountain from 3, but it's segmented via a menu that doesn't have the charm of Tricky. Huge improvements are found in its sense of speed thanks to camera shake and motion blur, audio mixing, but that's brick-walled by uber tricks now causing a slow motion breakdown of animations that you quickly get tired of seeing. It's very modern fighting game super, and I'm right, stop making me watch the cutscene, just kill me! On Tour could be considered a remix of SSX up until this point. Very few ideas here are new, but they don't relate to one another quite the same way they used to. At the same time, it's a game with a lot of 1 step forward and 2 steps back. In developing a strong punk feel, it throws away a sleekness that was present previously. The game emphasizes speed, but doesn't make what you're speeding through interesting in its own right. You get to make your own character, at the sacrifice of all the surrounding characters being devoid of personality. Elements of play never quite come together like Tricky or 3. Take for example the mountain aspect. In 3, the mountain is a clever illusion. It's a collection of courses stapled together via loading zones and convenient endpoints that mask the game pulling data from the disk. It segments the space for events and then shoots you back into the mountain once you've finished to reinforce the idea that this is one continuous space. A menu is provided to let you travel between missions so you don't have to constantly navigate the entire space to get where you want to be. Crucially though, the menu fast travels you in front of a point where you can choose to enter the mission. You can view this as redundancy, the player deliberately chooses a mission, so putting them near the area instead of straight into the mission is an inefficiency. The magic show of games relies on this inefficiency, and in On Tour, by optimizing that experience, fails to create a convincing illusion. There's a suggestion in 3 that the mountain is more persistent than it actually is by bookending every mission with this ritual of entering the space. You're never forced to engage with the mountain for extended periods of time, while always provided a sense that that the space behind and in front of you exists irrespective of your interaction with it due to its existence prior to every mission. In On Tour, you press a button and you're going. Fight Kaori, we made Simon White now. You might notice that the mountain is one connected sequence, but the lack of ritual makes it feel as though you're replaying the same content over and over as opposed to engaging with a larger concept. Here's a song that's actually really good. I hope if you haven't played On Tour, this might explain the one step forward, two step back aspect. A technically more competent package while lacking jagged design that gives it personality. It isn't inherently bad, it's just that in proximity to the other games, there's a sense that it's a jigsaw with a piece missing. A game where the highs have been compressed to not hurt your ears, but in the process lacking the punch to make it feel impactful. In another time, in a different space, On Tour would have been considered great, and in many ways it still is. However, when you're the fourth in the lineup of progressively fantastic games, in the eyes of the reviewer, great doesn't stand out as much. It was still splattered with praise, but unlike other games in the franchise, those reviews weren't as consistently glowing. Even though there's a lot to love about SSX On Tour, the game doesn't feel as groundbreaking as its predecessors. Hopefully the next game in the series will add as much substance as this one added in style. Enjoyable, without being extraordinary. However, relative to its competition, On Tour reviewed pretty well. Extreme sports as a gaming trend had run out of gas at this point. There was a momentum pushing it forward, but otherwise it had stopped gaining speed. Activision had tried all they could, fracking the audience with wakeboarding for every penny it could get, but a consistent string of games performing poorly outside of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater had them stop exploring options. Dave Mirra's BMX flopped out once Z-Axis got so horny that it burned the entire franchise to the ground. The competition for extreme sports dominance had as much life then as Queen Elizabeth II has in her today. Even inside of the Tony Hawk's franchise, while the games were still performing well financially, critically it was trending towards a cliff face. Here's Activision's financial report for financial year 2006, the one that opens with a picture of Over the Hedge. Despite the poor critical performance, Tony Hawk had generated up to $1.1 billion in revenue at this point. This is a $150 million increase from last year, the year with pictures of Shrek in it. These are both real, by the way. Unsuccessful experimentation might have pushed away further expansion, from opportunists that saw the trend and the eager parasites within the company. But that doesn't mean that already established names necessarily suffered. Looking through the 2006 financial report, you can't find concrete details about SSX's performance, but you can find a repeated, worrying trend. Unlike the previous years, EA never provides it a passing acknowledgement and omits discussing SSX when talking about the hits. The big boys were Need for Speed, again, Madden, again, FIFA, again, and The Sims, all selling over 5 million units. SSX's only mention is while talking about how increases in the company's sales between 2005 and 2004 were offset by a drop in performance from SSX. This was also a pretty good year for EA, drawing in 200 million in profit, so while it follows a general fall in growth, SSX is positioned into uniquely slow sales. Between SSX 3 and Tricky, this can be marked down purely to not having a game in the financial year 2004. In the time between 3 and On Tour, the effect is both a game not releasing for 2005 and the effects of the console lifecycle, the latter of which would directly impact the franchise. The PlayStation 2 at this point was 5 years old, the GameCube and the Xbox were 4. This was the end of the console generation where consumer hardware was advancing so rapidly. Given so much time, new games on the market had to compete against the accumulated second-hand market, and they were losing. When the console generation hits 4 years deep, the most knowledgeable members of its audience need a game to blow them out of the water to be worth picking up. Remember that this many years in, if you were knowledgeable on games, keeping up with magazines and forums, chances are you were aware of all of the games that you haven't gotten around to yet. You might occasionally have a new blockbuster title, but chances are if you're glancing around at a game store and see something you've been told is good but not great, well, let's try this Metal Gear thing out for 20 quid less. Secondhand games are affected by the usual supply and demand effects, but also prone to the problem of time and relevance. The older a game is, the cheaper it will end up being. The further back in a series a game is, the cheaper it will end up being. On Tour wasn't just competing against Tony Hawk and all of the other trash on the shelf, it was actively competing against itself. And before those rats at GameStop were trying to pump and dump their stock, they were trying to pump and dump their copies of SSX Tricky. There was a substantial financial incentive for retailers to have customers buy a second-hand game where they didn't have to deal with EA's prices. They could buy a game second-hand, where GameStop dictated the value of the product from uninformed sellers, and then sell the game on at a margin much greater than when they'd buy directly from the company. To directly quote GameStop's 2005 financial report, used video game products generate significantly higher gross margins than new video game products. This is the face of someone who bought secondhand. This is the gussy and blur of someone who just bought On Tour. This wasn't just the perspective of GameStop, this was the whole industry. This was all dedicated media retailers. Not to mention, from personal experience, a period where the car boot sale and secondhand market for physical media could exist entirely without the view of a middleman. The environment was one where the most invested audience members had to be either extremely attached to a franchise, as was the case with Tony Hawk, or had to be critically blown away enough not to buy secondhand, as was the case with Need for Speed Most Wanted, which is still regarded as the peak of the series by many people. The least invested audience, which was the largest audience, rarely brought new, especially if you were in a poorer demographic. EA could pump out a borderline identical version of Madden every year and see a decent return because the concept of American football is so deeply ingrained in American culture that there's a large amount of people who are happy to repay for the same game year on year. This is the same with FIFA, maybe even more important with FIFA considering the increased value in the sale in a European market. EA Sports has a business model where culture maintains a consistent base of users who will always be willing to pay so that the names on their 106 polygon man are the same as in real life. Snowboarding doesn't have that privilege. It's impossible to say exactly how SSX performed. EA releases the numbers that they legally have to and then twist those numbers into a reason to buy into the stock. In that omission of a franchise, if not a sign of disappointment, is a sign of a downward trend. Perhaps EA had seen the writing on the wall. The next generation of consoles was around the corner, and what started as a flashy way to show off new hardware and compete against a potentially growing audience was a magic trick of the early 2000s and nothing else. In the following year, EA would abandon the big title. Going forward, there was still a strategy to diversify with the original IP, Mirror's Edge, Dead Space, Skate, but there was a sense that SSX as a mildly arcadey title didn't fit into their business model. In many ways, I'd actually argue this is a blessing in disguise. For more conventional sports games that were being churned out, there was a focus on expanding the profit margin, especially in ways that didn't interact with retailers. They didn't want their games to just be games, they wanted their games to act as storefronts inside of people's homes and inside of people's phones, Frankensteining StarCraft for the English into a casino for children. In the long term, this would end up being the future of the industry, but EA might have been a little bit early to the punch, and for it would suffer year after year of losses. During the start of this downturn, they released SSX Blur for the Wii. The fact that you probably haven't heard of it should give you a good idea of how it went. It's SSX On Tour in a more smoothed out, childlike aesthetic that plays more like Tricky, and controls that feel like a sudden drop in blood pressure. If that feels like a breeze over what might seem like very important information, know that I'm just taking cues from EA themselves, who never brought up the name in their 2007 financial report. In the meantime, the Tony Hawk's franchise had a hard landing coming into the next generation, and in a move that almost seemed counterintuitive, in 2008 EA would fill the gap the Birdman was leaving behind with Skate. A lot of people remember it well. The estimations from services like VG Charts put it over 1 million. Without a proper word from the company though, I'd be pulling numbers out of my Ouroboros. In many ways, the contest between Activision and EA had faded away from the extreme sports diarrhea pipe, morphed instead into the landfill speedrun contest. Despite an indirect struggle for market dominance, the only rule of who wins is who can milk their IP cow the hardest. So even if Activision milked Tony until all he could trickle out was Pro Skater 5, it didn't particularly matter. Between 2008 and 2011, Activision was sitting on a combined profit of $1.5 billion, with EA sitting on top of a healthy $2.2 billion in losses. The exact reasoning for this is more complicated than the scope of even a Joseph Anderson-length video. The important part is that a sustained downswing brought about a need for stability. Keeping up with competitors was important. What good is that though if your company isn't even alive? In searching for sure hits, EA would start to reignite games from a golden period for the company. In 2012, they'd put out a reimagination of Need for Speed Most Wanted, a revamp of FIFA Street, and run it back with SSX. Unlike the original SSX, this game dropped the illusion of a spectator sport, instead trying to implement an aspect of grit and edge to the experience. You were hurtling yourself into the unknown, racing to the bottom, racing to survive. Calling it a departure would be an understatement. It was identifiably SSX while also being basically unrecognizable. You had the tricks, you had the boost, you had a lot of the characters, yet all of that familiarity was put together in unusual ways. Tricking here is nothing like the previous games, in both the controls and more importantly, the consequence. From Tricky and onwards, bigger tricks put you in longer states of potential failure, an important element of risk that makes certain tricks applicable and non-applicable. You are encouraged by the environment to recognize what options are available to you at what time, both to maximize your score and your boost, and minimize potential loss. 2012 is hooked on sugar. The tasty treat of Tricky is applied to every trick once you max out your boost, while also holding no concept of risk. You can start and end a trick almost instantly, so the period of vulnerability is not only up to the player, it's up to the player without any friction. In the beginning, this feels amazing. There's about 10 minutes at the start of every play session where the limitless possibility is euphoric, but a sugary indulgence inevitably leads to a crash. Once you snag against one too many moments that feel like a close call, you're able to recognize that there was never any risk to your actions, and from that point, every trick feels like it's infantilizing. EA turning the jangled keys from your younger self to current you, balding and withered, and as you stare into the sheen of multi-million-dollar budgets, wonder whether this medium was worth anything in the first place. At least you feel really fast though. 2012, while still being an SSX title, clearly didn't want the focus to be on tricking in the same way as the previous games. Tricks were instead supposed to act as a glue holding together the traversal of the mountain, and something that could be incorporated into the game's new systems of item modifiers to morph certain elements of gameplay. Each new item attempts to keep the game fresh. A wingsuit that lets the game work with larger gaps, ice picks that let the game mix up the terrain, avalanches that kept the same core gameplay but reframed it, literally. Modifiers are minor enough to never overwhelm the core experience, most of the time, and allowed particular concepts additional time in the spotlight, and on paper that's a great idea. Items like the wingsuit show off how, in spite of simplified tricking, other areas of the game could still satisfy that big, medium, small rule that provides a rhythm, to create a beat, to make this a point of tension and this an area of relief that eventually works its way back to anticipation. While this does exist within the game, 2012 is also frightful of building on top of its good ideas. The wingsuit shows up for about 3 missions and then disappears for the rest of the game, and it's the same story across every single fleeting idea that this game has. It clumps together a single concept, and then just as you get familiar with it, it ends up abandoned. What should have been a game that's filled with little novelties is instead a stop-and-start panic that's got just as much confidence in its systems as TikTok has in your ability to watch more than 7 seconds of unbroken video. Much like TikTok, individually, some of those videos are good. One of them is fantastic, and they should have made a whole game around it. But sit with it long enough, and what might be great pockets amalgamates into sludge. A sludge that asks the question, does SSX belong in 2012? In terms of reviews, the answer to that was, sure, why not? For all my gripes with the experience, the general consensus at the time wasn't just positive, it was glowingly positive. When Jack DeVries, writing for IGN, describes it as, SSX is the video game this generation has been missing. It wasn't for a game that was merely liked. There was a decent portion of those tasked with writing about it who fell in love with it. If online consensus is anything to go by, my feelings towards the game are in the minority even today. Underneath this though was a murmuring of what is effectively a game's death rattle, an abundance of 7 out of 10. While game reviews generally trend quite high, there's a persistent bias towards the new. A game that is just alright in the first week might be an 8 out of 10, but thinking back on it a month down the line, chances are with some time to distance yourself, you can see it as nothing special. And games that blow you away with spectacle might later be realized for a week of your life without any substance. This isn't to mention how, at this point, SSX was now being reviewed by people who themselves might have grown up playing SSX, dreaming of seeing their reviews in the magazines that they were reading. Nostalgia plays both a part in reception and sales, a fact that EA would have banked on to drive a successful launch. Outside of that though, what was really keeping this game in the spotlight? If Google search terms are anything to go by, which, you know, it's flawed, the general interest in extreme sports was down, and after the global financial crisis, something as luxury as winter sports plummeted in interest. On a practical level, that means less people snowboarding. But unlike Unlike the appeal of luxury cars that are flashy, universally understood displays of wealth that in turn keep them appealing to a large swath of people even in financially difficult times, snowboarding was a niche hobby that was only significant to particular geographic locations. If you aren't somewhere that has a mountain or wealthy enough to get there during the few seasons it's viable, snowboarding just doesn't appeal. There was a generation of late teens and early to mid 20s who might have still been interested, but the new generation to carry the game from million to multi-million sales wasn't there. SSX could have been a fantastic game, and to many it was, but it was a game that recreated a spark of a different time, one where flying high with a piece of birch between you and an icy impact was so present that it couldn't be seen for the expensive fad that it was. In years prior, SSX was a corner pin in the budding label of EA's annual reports. In 2012, while they were happy to champion titles like Fight Night and Spore, SSX went unacknowledged in a year that acted as a return to form for the company. For the first time in 4 years, EA was profitable, and in boasting about everything from Bejeweled to Mass Effect, between 208 pages, they didn't feel the need to spare 3 letters to let investors know SSX was even there. By all indicators, SSX 2012 would have failed to meet expectations within the company. What was, and still is, seen as an embodiment of the time between millenniums, no longer in the pulse of the mainstream. In the time that's passed, EA has returned to one of the most profitable companies within the gaming industry. Going from losing $1 billion to 2009, they made $1 billion in 2024. And while this might imply a trend of acute malice or squeezing of the customer, it's a trend of making more products at the time, though perhaps both can be true. In the 2010s, they'd eventually shift towards multiplayer-driven experiences, sometimes in ways that were really good, and microtransactions. The sin of greed occludes us from God's light. Eventually, as the live service model proved more profitable than making one-time experiences, the games that EA would produce would shift with the money. And in 2025, they're attempting to gear towards the infinite mega platform with Battlefield 6, following in the footsteps of Call of Duty Warzone. That sounds really sustainable and good for the workers. Good job. To say the competition with Activision is still blazing would be an understatement. I can smell the money being burned all the way from England after all. With the way EA has conducted itself in recent years, perhaps it was good that SSX ended where it did. It was a product that seemed initially to be made out of pure passion, sustained for the competition, and died off right before it could be merged with the trends of the AAA market. It's better to go out with enough highs to be remembered fondly than to overstay your welcome. While it's easy to come away from this with a sense that games were better in a different time, the SSX could only exist when games were more pure, that's not necessarily true of what the environment was. A lot of games that were made upwards of 20 years ago weren't unique blossoms against the fray of market trends, they were market trends themselves. Off-the-wall games were experiments that might have been passion in the developer's eye, but from the publisher's perspective were always attempts to tap into undiscovered areas of profit. The initial SSX is a prime example of that. It was brief and small, and its direct sequel was merely a more polished version of what came before, with a scope slightly beyond a trial run. What was once a mirage of pure experimentation exists today though. Occasionally it comes from a larger company, but daily, the vision of small teams are brought to life in the indie market. To some, SSX was a damn good set of games, to others an indication of trends and culture, and to others a product that would increase a company's profit margin. None of those perspectives tell the full story. In reality, at the time it was made, it was all of those things at once.